The Gospels were probably not eyewitness accounts.
Chris asserts that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses, and he gives 5 compelling reasons why he doesn't think the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. But I ask, first, are those 5 reasons compelling? And second, does it even matter? Could the Gospels not being eyewitnesses actually be their strength, not their weakness? That is what we're going to talk about today. But let's get into the first things of what Chris says. So, I want to clarify first of all, Chris is very minute in the details of what he says are eyewitnesses. That specifically Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were eyewitnesses in seeing what Jesus did and recording it, hearing what his teaching is. He is not talking about, do the gospel accounts include eyewitnesses' reports? I just want to get that out right off the top. He's talking specifically were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John eyewitnesses. And just to clarify a little bit more before we get into that, is we actually know this is very true. So Matthew, we could argue, is a possible apostle of Jesus, and John. But Mark, all of tradition tells us that Mark was not an apostle of Jesus. He's not recorded as one of the apostles in the list in the Gospels. And the same is with Luke, who is a companion of Paul the apostle. He wasn't. Paul the apostle, who is not actually discipled by Jesus, but a later messenger of the gospel of Christianity. So let's get into his 5 reasons. First of all,
biggest reason is that the Gospels have a literary dependency on each other.
What he means by that is the Gospels, especially the Synoptics, are closely connected to the other ones and dependent on them. So much so that Dan Wallace pointed out that of the 660 verses in the Gospel of Mark, 600 of them are copied by Matthew. Matthew, if he was being an eyewitness, really copies way too much off of Mark. He's way too dependent on Mark. And that's a valid point. The second
reason I don't think these are eyewitness accounts is that the earliest historical reports we have about these Gospels don't seem to justify it.
What Chris means by this is those who report that they were authentic eyewitnesses, he's not convinced that they are accurate. The most commonly cited is Papias, and his whole claim that Matthew wrote first in his native tongue, or in Hebrew or Aramaic, depends where you're looking at that. And the Gospel of Matthew is clearly not originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew. It was written in Greek. So he dismisses that this report doesn't line up with it. Interestingly enough, I was watching Faith Because of Reason, and they have a much more exhaustive list of early 1st, 2nd century testimonies to who wrote the Gospels, when, and why, which is interesting to check out. You should check out the links below to see that one. I'm not going to go into that one. That was a very long one. I actually didn't get to the end of it because it is like over an hour long of why he thinks the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But back to Chris. His third reason is...
The third reason I don't think the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses is the tremendous theological development and divergence that you see between the Gospels. Each of the Gospels preserves a distinct theological perspective. Each of the Gospel writers...
Picking up on the easiest example is in the Gospel of Mark, which is commonly referred to as the Messianic secret, in which it is not clearly revealed that Jesus is the Messiah, to the Gospel of John, where there's seven statements of Jesus says, I am, pretty much filling he was God. Definitely a development in theology there. And I'm going to push back a little bit on this with Chris. I understand maybe why he thinks that doesn't work. But I would like to give a testimony of an eyewitness account in which there was a development of perspectives, even though the exact same story happened. So years ago, I was taking a merge ramp onto a busy highway, and a few cars ahead, a motorcycle swerved a little bit, jumped off of one car, banged up against a semi, and fell down. I saw it right in front of me, all of it happening. And I was a eyewitness to this accident. A couple cars down, one of the eyewitnesses who actually got out of his car faster and was tapping on my window yelling, "Call the cops, call the cops, call the cops," asserted that the semi had driven over the motorcyclist's head, which had not happened. But even though we were both eyewitnesses to the event, we had different perspectives of how the motorcyclist, who at the time was laying down on the asphalt, of how he got there and why he was laying there not getting up. So fourth of all,
Number 4, the Gospels contradict each other on really critical things.
and the biggest one he picks on is, so in Matthew and Luke, we have 2 different birth stories of Jesus. And he understands that, yes, you could harmonize them, but he's like, the clear, easiest reading of the scriptures, the Gospels, there cannot be harmonized. So why is that? And the 5th reason,
Final reason I don't think the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses are the cultural and geographic issues in the Gospels.
first of all, we're pretty confident that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and so did his original disciples, the original 12. But all the Gospels are recorded in Greek. So there's a translation happening there. It's probably not of the original. And beyond the Gospel of Mark, which has, not so good Greek, Luke and Matthew are fairly polished for Koine Greek. It's not classic Greek, but Koine Greek is fairly well polished. So he's kind of puzzled with the whole, well, how could these backwood Nazarene, these Galileans, become scholars so quickly in their life? He says it's possible, and he gives that possibility that they could become scholars in their lifetime, but it's highly unlikely that grown adult men would become academically that well before their death. We were busy evangelizing the known world at the time. And as a little side notes, as he sees it, Mark gets some of his geography incorrectly. And if Peter was there, actually living there, he would get it right, which is a valid point. That being said, I've lived here for a long time, and I still get some of my geography wrong. Eyewitness accounts can be wrong. Now, I don't want to be an apologist here. I don't want to argue of whether or not the Gospels were eyewitness accounts. I have read books like Jesus and the Eyewitness, who's very adamant that there's much information. You can look in the Gospels and beyond the Gospels of how you could see that they were eyewitness accounts. And they're very valid. I've heard lots of videos, and Testify, I think, it was one who really cites them a lot a few years ago, in on-design coincidence of how, if you look at the 4 Gospels, that one Gospel answers a question the other Gospel raised without them actually working together on answering or raising that question. And it's an interesting read. My wife bought me this book recently. Guess I'm about 3/4 way through this one. The historical tell, similar concept in that Luke Acts were written by an eyewitness, being Luke, and that he tells about, and there's different ways of you can see that. That reminds me of story of, so you were thinking of buying a blue car. Let's just call it a blue car. We won't get into the brand or model. And you go to bed and wake up in the morning, and as you're driving to work in your non-blue car, you start noticing blue cars, blue car. And after about a week of this, you notice blue cars everywhere. It's not that there's no more blue cars. It's just now that you become aware of blue cars. And I really do think that in some ways, when you're looking for evidence of eyewitnesses in the Gospels, they're blue cars. You're going to find them. At the same time, if you're looking for evidence of not blue cars, you're going to find them. It's just a matter of where you want to land before you even get started. Reminds me of that story of Jesus. I forget, some father was in distress and he's lacking the faith or whatever for the healing. And Jesus turns to him and is like, believe. And he says, help me overcome I want to believe, help me overcome my unbeliefs. That in some ways, whether or not the Gospels were eyewitnesses or not eyewitnesses, It's just your choice of how you want to overcome your unbelief by gathering the evidence you're looking for. This book is nothing to do with the Bible. Well, I don't think there's any of it really in there. It's an interesting read, though. This is actually about the company, the Hudson Bay Company. I just recently read this book. And why I bring that into play is Stephen R. Bond is not an eyewitness to the establishment or the growth of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada. But he does an incredibly good job of going through the many original eyewitness sources and bringing them together in balance to present his story as he views the company growing and then ultimately its demise. It reminds me of, I don't know if you guys ever heard of Hitler's table talks. So, between 1941 and 1944, there were these men who would sat and did write shorthand of Hitler's little conversations while he ate dinner. He would go on these big rants and monologues about foreign policy, the war, and religion, and philosophy, and science, and all those other things that Hitler had. The interesting thing is, and this is for you, Bart Ehrman, the originals have been lost. So all we have right now is copies of copies of copies of copies. And it's just hilarious when you actually look into when critical scholars talk about even this more recent history, like these sayings of Hitler. But why I bring this up is, so those are eyewitness accounts. But if you were to read them to understand what was all happening during World War II, they would be a bad read for you. They would have a perspective, and they would be one perspective. Hitler's perspective. Or, as some even argue among the scholars, the publisher's